Welcome to the recording of the 2023 Southern Author Expo. I'm Rachel, I'm the Adult Outreach and Event Coordinator, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to this recording so you can catch up on all the fun that we've had. Many thanks to the Friends of the Library for their generous sponsorship of this event. To learn more about them and get involved, check out greenvillelibrary.org/friends. Today I'm so pleased to welcome two wonderful authors who spoke to us for a while and then had a Q&A session. First up, Phoebe Zerwig. Phoebe Zerwig is an award-winning investigative journalist, narrative writer, and college professor. Her writing has appeared in O, the Oprah magazine, National Geographic, The Nation, the Winston-Salem Journal, and Glamour, among other publications. Her work has been recognized by the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard University, investigative reporters and editors, the Society of Professional Journalists, Columbia University, and the North Carolina Press Association, and featured in the HBO documentary The Trials of Daryl Hunt. A graduate of the Journalism School at Columbia University, Zerwig is the director of the journalism program at Wake Forest University, where she teaches writing and journalism, including courses taught at the law school in collaboration with the director of Wake Forest Innocence and Justice Clinic. She lives in Winston-Salem, North Carolina with her husband, a dog, and 3 cats. Between them, they have 3 grown children. Next, we have Scott Gould. Scott Gould was born, raised, and still lives in South Carolina. His first book, Strangers to Temptation, a linked story collection the Atlanta Journal-Constitution called a compulsive read, and forward reviews dubbed funny, often poignant, and not easily forgotten, was published by Hub City Press in 2017. Of his debut novel, Whereabouts, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution said the book is distinctly Southern but gritty, without a whiff of moonlight and magnolias. Gould's memoir, Things That Crash, Things That Fly, was released in March 2021, and the new novel, The Hammerhead Chronicles, was released in early 2022. His fiction and nonfiction have appeared in Kenyon Review, New Stories from the South, Black Warrior Review, Carolina Quarterly, Pithead Chapel, Garden and Gun, New Ohio Review, Crazy Horse, and The Bitter Southerner, among others. He is a 2-time winner of the SC Art Commission's Individual Artist Fellowship in Prose and the South Carolina Academy of Authors Fiction Fellowship. He lives in Sans Souci, South Carolina, with a cat and a dog, and teaches creative writing at the South Carolina Governor's School for the Arts and Humanities. He is always pulling for the Braves. Welcome, Phoebe and Scott.
Phoebe's really organized. She's got a plan, a lesson plan for us. So part of the lesson plan says that I go first and I tell you about this book. First, I want to thank the library and Rachel for having us here. One of the great things about writing and being involved in this is you get to meet new friends like Phoebe. I did not know her before I started reading this book of hers, which, by the way, is phenomenal. You need to get this book and read it. It's a wonderful book. Anyway, but I have a new friend, and we're going to talk about that. But first, this book. This is a memoir called Things That Crash, Things That Fly. I'm going to just give you a top-line synopsis of it. We'll talk in more depth about sort of things. But it's the story of a marriage going bad. But it's also the story of many other things. In a nutshell, my wife at the time and I were scheduled to take a trip to Italy, and which we couldn't afford, to meet some friends there. And she told me about a week or so before we left, she was leaving me when we got back from Italy. I thought, well, hell, we ain't going there. But I did, and I thought, I can say this, and it didn't go well. But that's one trip. A few years later, I got a fellowship to go back to Italy and study the story that I uncovered when I was on that not-so-great trip in my ex-wife's ancestral hometown about a fighter pilot going down in World War II and how the town saved him and saved his body to give it a proper burial before the Nazis did something to it. And so I got a fellowship to go back and research that, and I said, yeah, I'm going to also cause some trouble with her ancestral. So that was another joke. So I had the book covers these trips to Italy, and ultimately I came sort of connected somehow with this fighter pilot named Guilfoyle, who went down in the blaze of glory, not unlike I did in that town years after him. So it's that. But it's always dangerous to tell you this, but I think it's funny too. So it's not. There's a lot of laughing that can go on this, which is something I tend to do in my writing. Just try to get people laughing about situations where you probably shouldn't laugh. But so anyway, that in a quick nutshell is things that crash, things that fly.
Thank you. That was a great synopsis, and your book is wonderful. It is really funny, but it's the parts that are just so lyrical and so beautiful to read. So I was laughing out loud, but then there were other choices where I was this is just gorgeous. So when Rachel invited us both to sit on this panel, I kind of was wondering, what the common thread line was going to be, other than the fact that these are both true stories, works of nonfiction. And we both found, when reading this book and then thinking about mine, there are a lot of common through lines about nonfiction and writing nonfiction and all kinds of things that we'll discuss. But first I want to give you a brief synopsis of my book, because it is a completely different story, at least on the surface, from Scott's book. It's called Beyond Innocence, The Lives. This sounds like it's not dead. Yeah. So I'll just speak up really loud, but I don't think it's going through. Is that one working? Yes. It is? Okay. So my book is a story of a case of wrongful conviction out of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, that I became involved with pretty early on. It's the story of Darrell Hunt, who was arrested in 1984 in a brutal rape and murder of a young newspaper editor in the same paper that I eventually ended up working at. He was a 19-year-old black man who was pretty quickly arrested and wrongly convicted, and then with the help of a dedicated lawyer and a group of activists in Winston-Salem, almost 20 years fighting this conviction. In 2003, I wrote a series of investigative articles for the Winston-Salem Journal, and that renewed interest in his case. And at the very end of 2003, he was released from prison when there was DNA testing done that actually identified the real killer and rapist of this case, and he was exonerated in 2004. And he went on to become a really important advocate for criminal justice reform in North Carolina. There's an incredible legacy of reform. He also traveled, certainly around the U.S. and even internationally, because of this documentary that was made about him. And so he really led the life in the way of a celebrity, and all of this pain that he endured and the full weight of all of this caught up with him. And in 2016, he took his own life, which is what drew me back into this story that I thought I was done with. So that's one of the parallels. We're both, to some extent, reluctant storytellers. So that's the synopsis of the case. But to me, what this really is a strong narrative about a man who had tremendous courage and resilience, and all the people that fought on his behalf. So it's kind of a good versus evil kind of story, and then the tragedy of finally what happened to him in the last couple of years of his life, and it was a hidden story. He had his public life of being doing well and being this really eloquent, beautiful speaker and beautiful advocate. And so to me, it's a really human story that extends beyond criminal justice, social justice story. And in that way, it has a lot in common with all kinds of nonfiction that have really nothing to do with justice reform and racism and history. And so that's what we're going to be talking about the rest of this panel. One of the things that I think Scott and I have in common is a real interest in place. So I became pretty obsessed with visiting all of the places that were important to Daryl Hunt's story, some of the prisons he'd been to, the homes he lived in, and the scene of the crime. And there's a lot of that beautiful that in Scott's book, and I thought we each wanted to read something, so I'm going to turn it over to Scott to read a really evocative scene from his book that has to do with place.
Okay. Is this still? Yeah. This is going to be a real short section. There was one of the things I needed to do when I went back to Italy to do my crazy revenge story, but also to do research. Guilfoyle was go to the crash site, even though it had been decades after that. I felt like I needed to go there. One thing to add in is that I have really bad knees, and at this point I was popping Lortab like chickens, trying to get up and down these mountains in Italy. So to get to this, I'm on a bad knee when I'm going to this crash site. So this is the moment where these folks that I met took me to the crash site where Guilfoyle had gone down. They found his body, and the villagers had taken him and protected him and gave him proper burial. As we neared the crash site, I expected at any moment to hear the hum of angels' voices, some sort of heavenly fanfare, expected to see some golden light off on the forest floor that signified holy ground, where a dead man came to earth and was rescued to a proper grave by a band of feisty villagers. When I wasn't watching my footing, I kept my eyes out for signs of the consecrated spot in the woods, for some signal that I had arrived at the sacred site where Guilfoyle found the beginning of his long rest. But the only thing that happened was Simone waved his beefy arm in the direction of the chestnuts just off the road and said, "Ecco qui, here it is." Luca explained that Guilfoyle's plane came down in this general area. They say very few pieces of it broke off. It just landed there. There was no big fire for some reason, just big noise. The ground they motioned to was perhaps a bit more clear than the other side of the road. The chestnuts didn't look any worse for wear, maybe a few younger, smaller ones, and a couple of dead trunks lying in the briars, which were thick and mighty. Danielle said a few years ago a man hunting mushrooms brought a metal detector to the site, but only discovered a few shards of steel. Claudio and Simone were impatient because they couldn't understand what Danielle told me, so he translated to them. Claudio's eyes lit up when he heard a mention about pieces of the plane. Around his cigarette, he told us that his grandmother had used a chunk of the plane's fuselage as a lid for her cook pot. Daniele said that soon after the crash, a procession of villagers came to the crash site and ripped the plane. "I know this is the wrong word," he said, "but you maybe get what I mean." Rip was the perfect description for the dismantling of Guilfoyle's plane. I already knew that the village was so poor during the war, they had to hone their resourcefulness just to survive. Ripping apart a plane that cooled under the chestnuts seemed like a justifiable act of them, I imagine. The light at the crash site filtered in wavering yellow shafts through the chestnut and poplar limbs. Spring seed pods from the chestnuts littered the ground like an army of mini porcupines under our feet. I looked at the legs of my jeans. They were dotted with the Italian equivalent of beggar's lice. The crash site was at Memorial in Guilfoyle. This was probably what it looked like before he came to Earth, wild and overgrown. Lucas said he heard the villagers watch the plane circle Sarah twice, using their prayers to keep the B-17 from hitting their building. Some of the witnesses said the plane was on fire. Some said it was only smoking. The difference between truth and the story, the difference between a fireball and a smoke signal. I like to imagine the chestnuts reached up from the mountainside and grabbed the Romar, that's the name of the plane, and pulled it to earth gently, almost peacefully. There was something disconcerting about standing in the place where a man died and fell to earth, even though there was no monument to the event. Then I realized what was missing. Sounds. It was strangely quiet under the chestnuts, probably the same sort of silence that enveloped the villagers while they stared at the smoking plane. That morning, surrounded by Simone and Claudio and Luca and Daniele, it was quiet like church. And for the first time since dawn, I didn't feel my need. So that's according to the crash site. So you're going to read us a section about you going to a special place, right? Or not? Not.
I could.
No, I thought you said, okay, all right. So you can talk about the truth and stories. And,
Yeah. You were going to talk
I
about.
was going to set you up for that.
You were going to set me up for the fact
Okay.
that how do you.
I'll do it. I got it. Back on track. No, I'm just kidding. One thing as I read through Beyond Innocence, I think that seemed like a common element is that these when you tell stories like these, as opposed to writing fiction where you can create the ending of the story, you can create the characters, you can create the plot line of the story. These stories have already been, they exist, they're already out there. You already know the ending of it, and especially this one, you knew the end of the story. So how do you, as a writer, that becomes a really tough task, is how do you engage the reader? How do you make something that will engage the reader, that makes them want to go and read the story, even though you might know the end of it. So it's not like reading a mystery or thriller where, ta-da, that's what happens. It's a whole different ballgame. My story obviously had an ending, and I was retrospectively telling it again. This story, Daryl Hunt's story, had an ending, and that's what struck me so much about this book is that the voice that Phoebe created to tell the story kept me in the story. It kept me moving through the story, even though I knew what happened. And that's an amazing task for a writer, and it's a challenge. And boy, you do that without. So that's what you're going to read.
That's what I'm going to read. So, this is court scene basically, and it's from the second conviction. So he was actually convicted twice for this crime that he was eventually exonerated. But just to go back to the scene you just read, I just love that. And a theme we could come back to is the difference between truth and story. Yeah. So we're in a rural, small town, North Carolina. They moved his second trial out of Winston-Salem to the Catawba County Courthouse in Newton, North Carolina. In his final hours of freedom, Hunt went to lunch with McGuff, that was the private investigator, at a Mexican place a short drive away from the courthouse, a place they'd been going to throughout the trial. McGuff had noticed how Hunt kept his cool throughout Bowman's argument, even when Bowman, who was the prosecutor, came up beside him and shook his fist at Hunt's face. Hunt's face fell into the familiar smile that police had always interpreted as a smirk, a smile that betrayed nothing. But now, with the verdict they knew was coming, McGuff felt a sadness in Hunt's bearing, so profound that years later, the memory would bring him to tears. To break the mood, McGuff hatched a plan. They would stage a fight, right there in the restaurant. Hunt would knock him to the ground, grab the keys to the Nissan, and flee. With luck, he could make it to Mexico before they caught him. A stupid joke, really, but the absurdity of it made him laugh. When jurors returned soon after lunch, Hunt noticed that not a single one looked his way, a sure sign of what was to come. Once again, he heard a voice in the otherwise silent courtroom proclaim his guilt in a crime he had not committed. He felt Stein, who was one of his lawyers, rub his shoulder, a gesture he would long remember. He heard each of the jurors affirm his verdict, their verdict, and once again he stared at the state seal on the judge's bench, determined that these lying fools would never see him cry. "Is there anything you'd like to say?" the judge asked. There was so much, but the only words that came to Hunt as he stood there in the silence was the plain truth. "I'd like to say in open court I'm innocent of the charges, even though I've been found guilty." The judge gave him a few moments with his lawyers in an office outside the courtroom before the bailiffs locked him in the holding cell. McGuff was allowed to visit him there, a glass partition separating the two unlikely friends. Hours earlier, they'd been telling jokes over lunch. It was hard now to know what to say in the face of such body-heavy sadness. "I'm not going to let this go," McGuff promised. Hunt had no time to return to Winston-Salem, no time to say goodbye to April, who was the woman he was falling in love with, or the rest of Briggs's family. No time for a final walk in the light rain which fell that cool autumn day. By evening, Hunt was back in prison, this time at the processing center for adults at Central Prison in Raleigh, a place that to Hunt smelled of death. If Hunt regretted turning down the plea deal that would have set him free, he didn't say.
One thing that struck us is we had a long phone conversations, email conversations as we thought about this, was the idea of being obsessed with a story. These are totally different stories, of course, but there's that obsession is a common feeling among, I think, a lot of writers. I don't know how many people here write, but there will be stories that are in your head, in your heart, in there somewhere that you can't get rid of. And with my story, with this, I had these two voices. I had this one voice going, "Do not write this story. Don't do this." But I had this other voice going, and it was the writer voice going, "This is too good to pass up. You've got fire products, you got Italy, you got the narrative arc is there." So that was something to fight with, but it wasn't until I found out about I went back and looked at Guilfoyle's story and got this fellowship to go back to Italy that I went, okay, that's the key that unlocks the story for me. It's this parallel story of this fighter pilot. But it didn't, I don't know who's writing, but you don't just sit down and bang it out. I mean, this is a process of years where you go through, you think about it, you start writing pieces, you put it away, you go back. It was for me. But it was always this constant kind of gnarly obsession. It seemed like when I read this, there's a part in Beyond Innocence where he told the story about him, but you're very much removed from the story. You're a narrator, but you're not a presence in the story. And then you open this one chapter, and there you are. You make this entrance. And I was wondering about if you could talk about being obsessed with this story, how that felt, and did you have, I don't know if I would dive into this, but you do anyway, right?
Yeah, I love the way you just put that, now you don't want to do it, but it's kind of too good to pass up. And I think there was a little bit of that going on with me, but after I wrote the series of stories in 2003, I really did think I was done with this whole thing. And then I didn't really become friends with him, but I got to know him pretty well, and I became friends with his attorney. And then I really thought I was out because in journalism, you really don't want to be writing about your friends. And you want to have some distance from your sources. And so then I started inviting Hunt to speak to my classes because I figured, okay, I'm just done with this, and we can become kind of like, sort of like colleagues. And I also didn't think I wanted to spend the rest of my life writing about criminal justice reform. And then all of that really changed for me when he was found dead in this. He was found in his friend's pickup truck in a parking lot with a gunshot wound in his abdomen, right across the Coliseum where Wake Forest played basketball. So this very familiar place. And I really, before I even thought I was going to write anything, I just became kind of obsessed with finding out what had happened. How had things gone so wrong for this man that people I was close to loved so much, and we thought he was doing okay. And so I really just set out to, using my reporting instincts, to try to find out what had happened. And that's what got me back into the story. And then as I found out more about what happened, then there was that voice of, no, don't do it, because it turned out that he'd been telling all of his friends that he had late-stage cancer to explain his weight loss, and it turned out that he was abusing drugs. And then I thought, wow, really don't do this. Like, who am I to tell this story that some people are going to see as attacking his character or undermining his legacy or undermining all these great things that he had done. And then I really thought, oh my God, who am I as a middle-aged white woman coming in here writing the story about this black man? But by then I was, as you say, kind of obsessed, and it was such the simple question of what happened felt to me like such an important story to tell about our time, and about our history, and about race, and about the damage that injustice does, and about the damage that our criminal legal system does. And then I wrote a magazine-length piece that kind of explored all these more moral issues. And then this never happens. And an agent called me, and she said, oh, you want to write a book? And I was like, no, not really. And she said, well, come on. And so I was kind of dragged to this, kicking and screaming. But the more I got into it to write the book proposal, the more interesting it became. And then miraculously, it felt to me, we got a publisher, and it really was this kind of obsession to find stuff out that kind of kept me going, because otherwise it's so much work to write a book. If you're not obsessed, I don't know how you get the energy to do it. I'll just put this down. But you also had this. There's a line in here where somebody in the village gives you this file about the case, and you weren't interested in it. And then you got interested.
Yeah. On that trip to Italy, the not so good. Both of them were not so good, actually. But anyway, the first there was a gentleman who was a lawyer in Florence was taking us around this little village where we were staying. The village has, in the winter, the village has like 80 people living there. It's a little bigger in the summer, like a couple hundred people. But and he was obsessed with the story of Guilfoyle. This village was obsessed with the story of Guilfoyle. He walked into that village, and within 2 hours, somebody in that village will be telling you about the time he saved the fighter pilot in World War II. It's a point of honor for the village. So he gave it to me, this file, and I've still got the envelope with this big handwriting. It says October, it's the title of October 1943. And he said, I hear you're a writer, you have to tell the story. You have to tell us. And he kept on and on about it. And at that point in time, I didn't really do that. I hadn't really interested. I got enough stories to tell. I don't need to talk about fighter pilots in World War II. And then it struck me that he wasn't telling me to do it. The reason he was telling me to do it was because he didn't want it to die. The people in the village that knew the story were getting old and passing away. And he was trying his best to just keep the story out there about what this village had done during that time of World War II. So I worked at the Government School for the Arts, still work at the Government School for the Arts, and at a certain point where you could apply to this national foundation to get a teaching grant. You proposed a project, and they would give you money to fund the project. So I proposed going over there and researching Guilfoyle. And so I did. They gave me enough money to get over there, and I stayed in the little village for 3 weeks. And I interviewed people. I'm no journalist. I was doing the best I could. But I was talking to folks, and I got obsessed with this story. And I started seeing the parallels between me. I started identifying with Guilfoyle. I started saying, and as a writer, that voice going, man, these elements are coming together. You got to do this. This is a book. This is something you can do. I resisted it. I talked about it more than I've ever talked about anything I write about. I mentioned it to other writer friends. I would talk, we had a guest writer here, a poet one time, big name poet, Jory Rayman, National Book Award winner. She was so nice. She said, what are you working on? Like Jory Rayman using that. It was really nice of her. And I said, well, I got this idea of a story. I just laid out the story, and she went, oh, you gotta write that. I went, okay, so if I'm telling writers who have a pedigree that they're going, yeah, this has got elements of the story, you need to do that. So that's when I kind of took the dive and said, all right, I'm going to start putting it together. And it's like you said, it's not easy. Writing a book is hard. For those of you out there who have done it, you know how it is. Writing a book is hard. It's not easy. You go up and down, it's not good enough, it's great. The next morning you wake up, it sucks. The range of emotions, self-doubt, it's all that you have to deal with in writing a book. But, and I tell my students, you've got to learn to love the process. You have to learn to love the idea that you took the scientific thing and you built a book around it. You took that story of Daryl and you made art. You made a book. You made this thing. And it's wonderful. And if you write, I think you have to learn to love that process. If you fall in love with getting published and trying to make the money and doing this stuff, you're not going to write the best book you can if you believe that.
Yeah, well, one of the things we talked about over the phone was the kind of the difference between a memoir and then, which is mostly from your point of view, except then you have all these interviews where you're kind of trying to get at what actually happened with this plane, and so you never really know if you really get at it. And then, I was writing so much from everybody else's point of view. And I think that's really interesting. How did you go from your story to these stories that all these other people were telling you that maybe you didn't really know yourself, and even with your own story, the story of your marriage is told from your point of view. You're not bringing in your ex-wife's point of view. But I'm just curious about how you navigated all these different points of you in your story?
So, well, that's a great question. I think the one thing I remember trying to concentrate on was always having the story move forward toward like the interviews with people, uncovering Guilfoyle and that story of the plane coming down, so tied into me. So if the story, if all these other points of view I can eventually wrap around into my story, then it all becomes organic, and then it all becomes, it keeps the story moving forward. That was the trick in structuring the book. It's like, when do you let some of these other people talk about the fiber pilot, and when do you talk about what you're going through, and how do you connect those? And that was sort of the challenge, and to be honest, that was the fun part of it. It's like, how can I try to build that off? But and also to be quite honest, I had to write, because of the strategic fellowship, I had to write an essay about Guilfoyle. So that helped too, because I had to actually do more of a journalistic / academic thing with the people. So I kind of got practice talking to them and doing that. And then when I started writing the book, once I established the idea that I'm Guilfoyle and I have this common bond, then those people's stories became my story, and kind of glue it together in that way. But I was interested in you with Beyond Innocence, in that, there's this extreme, like there's David Shields, right in front of mine. He says it doesn't matter whether it's the truth or not. It's good for the story, put it in. Whether it's real, fiction, whatever, just put it all together. And then you got the other people that I read, like Susan Orlean, who says she doesn't put anything in her book unless she got a note or a recording or something. She can document that it happened. So something like this, I was closer to her, but I'm not on this extreme. But where do you exist? How do you treat that? With your journalistic background, like I remember reading one line in there where somebody thought something. So a character thought something, and I went, how do you do that? And then I go, well, you had an inkling, but you knew that person hadn't thought at that moment. Right?
So I'm on the Susan Orlean front, so everything in here is far, I fact check every single thing that's presented as fact. So if somebody told me something, I suppose, there's always the question about whether somebody's memory is accurate or whether it really did happen as they said it happened. And this thing is so filled with footnotes. Everything is footnoted, and there's the chapter at the beginning that's about Darryl Hunt's childhood, where I was kind of playing with being a little bit more less tuned to the facts. And then my editor came in there and he said, no, you can't use his words unless you put it in quotation marks. So, or his vernacular unless you put it in quotation marks. So it is, for example, the passage I just read, I think there's some line that said that a light rain fell. So thanks to weather.com, you can go back and check the weather in Hickory, North Carolina in November of 1990. You can see what the weather was that afternoon. So, and the line, I had access to Darryl Hunt's journals and letters, so if there's something that's what he's thinking, that's footnoted, and that's what he was writing about. So I am, because of my newsroom training, I am obsessed with fact checking.
Right.
And that's because I've always had to be. Yeah.
Those Darryl Hunt's journals are a fascinating part of the book, especially the fact that his early journals are very, his writing style is very immature and kind of elementary, and then as the years go by, reading more and listening to journals get more and more beautifully lyrically in some cases. I thought that was anyway. That's all I had to say about that. So I think that was it's open for questions.
You said that the stories were too good to pass up. You're trying to pass them up, and each of you in different ways say that other people really encourage you or focus your attention. And I was just weighing that internal and external motivation about nonfiction, especially where you have these constraints at the end of the story is already known. Do you find it more challenging when someone external is offering you that challenge, or how do you balance that out?
I have a very curated list of people that I will talk to about, so I truly trust them. I mean, this one I maybe told a few more people because I just couldn't figure out what to do with it. But I've only got like a handful of people that I will either show work to or talk to work about. And I'm not in a writer's group or anything like that. But I just got some friends, because I've been doing this a long time, that I've got old friends who are writers who I trust. And they will tell me out now, this is crap. This idea does not work. Don't spend your time on it. They'll say there's something there. And I trust them. But ultimately, you got to trust yourself, because you're the ones that do the work. You got to say, I'm ready to dive into this. I'm ready to invest the time and the energy and the soul-sucking parts of it to write a story. And that's what it was a matter of just saying, I need to tell this. It's something that, as a writer, you don't want to pass up. You're always going to have those stories that you say, I can't pass this up. It's just the world. Sometimes the world lays these things out for you. I can't write jobs or whatever. But this is my hand. In this case, it happened to be about me, and not very time of my life. That was the thing that kept going. And I don't do this kind of stuff. This one was.
So that's a really great question. It's really got me thinking. Just now, so my answer is not going to be very well formed, but I come out of the newsroom, so most of my life, I often came up with my own story ideas, but I wasn't doing anything ever that didn't have an editor backing me, and really that didn't have a pretty quick deadline hanging over my head. So I'm pretty motivated by outside influences. And then I became a freelancer and I started teaching. So all the freelance work that I did was, again, assignments motivated by outside influences. And I think, actually, this book was probably the first time in my journalism career that I really moved towards a more internal motivation. So when Darryl Hunt died, I had nobody saying, oh, yeah, here's your deadline, get us this story. It was really that obsession that I was talking about, and my curiosity, and a little bit of sense of responsibility that kicked in, that somebody had to keep the story alive, and I was the one who was going to have to do it. So, so when I wrote that magazine piece, that was really me, and I did find an editor, but that was all me-driven. And I think I'm kind of moving into a new phase of, storytelling and writing. I'm taking a sabbatical right now and working on a couple of things, but I'm not ready to talk about that are really driven by me. There's no external anybody giving me a deadline or saying, oh yeah, that's a great idea.
I have a journalism background, and so this is probably more directed to you, and more in the publishing end. Do either of you use Substack? And if so, do you think it is a way to get your work published in a way that like blocked books was like 50 years ago? And publishing, we're all like, especially with the strike going on.
No, I know some friends that use Substack. I'm not in that world. You know, publishing is just so weird these days. You know, but anytime somebody asks me a question about, I know you said you were journalist background. Anytime anybody asks you a question about publishing, how to get published, what to do publishing wise, I say, the first thing you have to do is write a really good story. If you write a really, really good story, it'll find its place. An agent might see your piece in a magazine, or see your short story in a literary magazine, or you write it and you get it out there and you go through the process of trying to find an agent, trying to find a publisher. But the first thing you do is, and you may already have that story, but yeah, I don't know. I know I've got two writer friends right now. I see them on social media begging people to go to their Substack, and they keep complaining that nobody's going there. Like, did you write something they want to read?
Well, and I'll just say for people who don't know, it is a way for you to self-publish a blog, but actually be able to charge people. So, like, where Blogspot 15 years ago was how the kind of one that started. Substack is maybe the last 2 years come out, and it is a way to minimum to you can have free for a month, but then people have to pay you like the minimum is $5 a month to read your work or to see your pictures, or you can do so. It's a way for like creative people to protect their intellectual property online.
I don't have a great answer to your question, but I know a lot of journalists who are now freelancers or doing something else, and they're using Substack and they're getting subscribers. And I think people think it's a good way to go, but I don't know much beyond that.
I have so much self-doubt. I don't think anybody wants to pay $5. Nobody's going to pay $5 to read what I got to say. And then that would probably prove my point when nobody did. Go there.
This is a curiosity question. You said at a point that I'm writing about all my friends and and then you kind of have a lot of trepidation about that. How'd that work out? Like how did that affect you? Well, more personally, but affect you?
Yes. Could you read my view a little bit about how it?
Sorry,
That's
you want me to
questions.
read it? Okay.
What's your belt? 2 inches from the line.
Gotcha. Okay, so Phoebe was saying at a point that she had trepidation about writing the personal stuff that she was going to write because these were her friends or her colleagues. And so I'm curious, so you persevered and did it, and how did that work out personally for you?
I think I got the question. I love babies, so I was really So the thing I had the most trepidation about was really writing about Darryl Hunt's hidden life, the part that he kept hidden. So the part about, for example, writing about Mark Rabel, the lawyer who would become my friend. I mean, he was, if he had said, "Oh, I don't want you to write this book," that would have been really hard. But he was really helpful and really wanted me to write the book because then he could be relieved of having to write the book. So he was all on board. But I was really, the thing I had trepidation about was prying into this hidden part of Darryl Hunt's life. And also that was a real research reporting challenge, because how do you find out
about a part of somebody's life that they kept hidden. That wasn't in his journals. He didn't talk about it publicly. And so I spent a lot of time, he and his wife had divorced, and I spent a lot of time talking to her, and of course all of his professional people had sort of discredited her. So that was really difficult. And then I got to know a couple of his friends who were outside of his public sphere. So friends he'd been in prison with, who he'd known actually when he was a teenager before any of them had gone to prison. And there was one man in particular who I spent a lot of time with, whose name is Ayub Rashid, and he appears towards the end of the book. And he and I talked about this, so even spending time with him, I knew he was going to be really important to understanding what Daryl was doing that his lawyer didn't know about. Now, Ayub has 2 rape convictions, so I was spending a lot of time with this man with this, pretty serious felony record. And he was really suspicious of me, wondering who this white woman was, trying to pry into Daryl Hunt's business. But eventually I think he felt that everybody missed the story and everybody was kind of preying on his friend, and that if anybody had really been paying attention, they would have noticed that Daryl Hunt was struggling. So he felt fine eventually about talking with me, and I'd ask him things and he'd tell me stuff, and I'd say, "You think you're okay with me publishing this?" And he was like, "Yeah, I don't care, go for it." And then I did something that journalists don't do, and if I had done this in a newsroom, I would have been severely reprimanded, but I let people read this chapters that were about them. There's a chapter that there was another woman who was raped by this man who had actually committed the original crime, and that's how I started doing that. But I cannot write about a woman being raped and her account of it without letting her reread it. And interestingly, the only part she wanted me to change a little bit was she's a very devout Christian, and she wanted me to add one more line, really giving voice to that, to her faith. And I had a lot about her faith in that chapter, but she wanted me to reverse the order of something. So, and Mark Rabel was fine with everything I wrote about him, and April Hunt was fine with everything I wrote about her, and Ayub was fine with everything I wrote about him and his friendship with Daryl. So that was how I resolved all that unease and trepidation, basically breaking some rules.
Last question.
Hi, I'm a children's historical fiction writer, and so I work on my first book's on sale right now, so I haven't published. But I was wondering how, with nonfiction, you go about plotting. Do you plot things ahead of time after you collect information, or do you like more pants as you're writing?
Well, it depends on I write mostly fiction, so this was a little different for me. So I'm really attuned to narrative, having a narrative arc. This was odd because it has sort of a built-in arc. This happened and this happened. Although I do go back in time and play with going backwards a little bit. But I'm not a big outliner. What I do is I get an idea of major scenes that need to be in a piece. Like I know this is what's going to happen. This was going to happen. And I'm a big fan of John Irving. John Irving said one time that he knows the last line of a novel when he starts a novel. So that gives him a compass heading. And it might go like this to get there, and you may be cutting something that's out, but he knows where it's going to end up. And I knew where this book was going to end up. And basically I had 3, there's another trip to Italy is in the far distant past in this. And so I knew I had 3 trips to deal with. So that's basically what happens. I knew I had in that form the art. But I'm not a big outliner. And I see these pictures of authors who have pages of the novels pinned to the wall. I don't operate that way. So I think it's everybody's got their own process. So you feel like, find out where your comfort zone is. Find out what makes you still want to stick with the book.
I wanted you to go first because you have something to compare to, fiction versus nonfiction. I don't have that comparison to make, but I did think scenes all the way through. The narrative is very chronological in this book, and I did have to plot it out because I had to plot it out to write the book proposal. But I didn't outline. Once I had the chapters laid out, I didn't outline each chapter. I did think scene primarily, and I think I had a ending line of the chapter in mind. So I was writing each chapter for the ending line or the ending scene.
All right, that's all the time we have for questions. Can I just say something? I think everybody here will agree. I wrote 2 books on grief, so of course everything comes is very personal and feeling. I just want to thank you for telling these stories. I want to thank you for taking these lives that never would have maybe anybody learned about. And I also think you lifted them up. And I truly believe you were called to do it. And I thank you for that. So, as writers, you put your heart in it. Your readers know. You can try to do the things we talked about to kind of do the tap dance. They know. And so everything that I write is from my heart. And that's the response that comes back. Because either you lived it yourself, or you're trying to tell the story of someone that you know that did. So thank you, Emma. Thank you.
Now, welcome to the Young Adult and Adult Fiction panel. Please note that the first few moments were cut off due to some technical difficulties, but you'll still have a great experience watching the rest of this performance. So 2 incredible authors joined us, Ashley Poston and Charlie Lovett. Ashley Poston loves dread pirates, moving castles, and starry night skies. Ash graduated from the University of South Carolina with a BA in English. Before becoming a full-time author, she worked in publishing as both a social media coordinator and a marketing designer. Her books have appeared on the Indie Next list multiple times and have been featured in Teen Vogue, 17, Entertainment Weekly, Hypable, BuzzFeed, and in the Goodreads Choice Awards. Her critically acclaimed sci-fi duology, Heart of Iron, was named on 2019's Rainbow List. Her first adult novel, The Dead Romantics, was Good Morning America's July Book Club pick, Barnes & Noble's fiction pick for July, an Amazon editor choice, and one of Publishers Weekly's best romances of 2022. It's also a USA Today and New York Times bestseller. When not writing, she plays Dungeons & Dragons and reads fanfic. She lives right here in South Carolina, and she's firm believers that we're all a bunch of weirdos looking at other weirdos asking for their username. Charlie Lovett has written or edited 9 books about Lewis Carroll, including Lewis Carroll, Formed by Faith, the first full-length study of Carroll's religious life. He has served as the president of the Lewis Carroll Society of North America, as editor of the London-based Lewis Carroll Review, and has lectured on Carroll in the U.S. and Europe at the Smithsonian Institution, Harvard University, UCLA, Oxford University, and elsewhere. Lovett's breakthrough as a fiction writer came when he combined 2 of his passions, rare books and the English countryside, to write the Shakespearean mystery The Bookman's Tale, a New York Times bestseller and Barnes & Noble Recommends selection, which has been translated into several languages. Parade magazine called the book a delightful tale of love and bibliophilia. Most recently, he's published 3 new books, all in 2022. The Enigma Affair, a thriller in which a small-town librarian and a professional assassin team up to solve a 75-year-old Nazi mystery. The Book of the 7 Spells, a middle grade adventure in which 4 very different children discover a magical library, and Lewis Carroll, Formed by Faith. When not visiting his cottage in Kingham, Oxfordshire, Charlie Lovett and his wife Janice live in Winston-Salem. They have 2 grown children, Jordan and Jimmy. Welcome, Ashley and Charlie.
Room of this famous writer as, just a normal part of the university. I said, if you preserve the rooms in Oxford of every famous person, they would have to then build the university somewhere else because there wouldn't be anything left.
Okay, but now my actual question. Fake out everyone. No, so I know that Lewis Carroll based a lot of his earlier Alice in Wonderland stories come from stories that he told a girl named Alice, right? And I also know that Lewis Carroll shaped a lot of children's literature right up onto C.S. Lewis. So what are some of how does religion and children's literature coincide? How does that?
So the story, the Alice story began in the same way that the Narnia story began, in the same way that the Hobbit began, that the Wind in the Willows began, by a grown-up telling an extemporaneous story to a child.
Yes.
In this case, the daughter of the dean of Christ Church and her 2 sisters. And Lewis Carroll set out to write a book of nonsense. It was supposed to just be good fun. It wasn't supposed to be religious, and it's not overtly religious. But when you look at the way he was raised, the books he read as a child, children's literature before Alice was mostly about, the adult is the center of the universe. The child is this vessel that exists, who does not have agency, exists to have knowledge and morality and religion crammed into it, and also is essentially evil until saved by the adults, right? Lewis Carroll writes a book where the child has agency. The child speaks truth to power, calls out adults on their nonsense, including royalty. And the child is now the center of the story rather than the adult being the center of the story. And it's the adults who act in unreasonable ways rather than the child. And that's pretty much what children's literature has been ever since.
Yeah, it has revolutionized children's literature.
And so it absolutely was. It's when you start to see it in context, it's almost inconceivable that an adult in 1865 would put this radical, subversive book into the hands of a child.
Yeah, and a lot of the tropes that we see in Alice in Wonderland has persevered through children's literature since then.
Yeah, I mean, the child being in charge. I mean, Harry Potter is not about how the cool things that the teachers do. It's about what the kids do.
Yeah, it's always about what the kids do. Yeah. The different, Ha! Y'all thought that I made a mistake, didn't you?
So let's talk about subculture for a minute, because you've written a lot of books that are sort of, you describe as being set in nerd culture or Comic Con culture, which is a culture I feel like I have a slight insight into because of a child who is fascinated by D&D and all these other things, and then I have a cheating insight into because I'm a massive fan of The Big Bang Theory and I've watched every episode about 10 times. But
fake nerd card.
That's my fake nerd card. Yeah, exactly. But could you talk a little bit about first of all, how you got into that culture, and then how do you take a subculture and put it into the context of a novel?
So I was a really weird kid who really, really loved animation when I was a child, and I really liked anime and manga. And so when I was a kid, I went out searching for other people who liked the same things I did, and it wasn't in my small town, which isn't small anymore, but it was back then, or I thought it was. And I found a community online, and that was where you went to go and nerd out and talk about different properties and different stories and different books, and that's kind of where I found where I was home. So when I was approached to write Geekerella back in 2016, the editor already knew that I was a part of that kind of nerdy subculture because I had talked extensively about it by then, and We had met before at a book convention, and we had nerded out over Sailor Moon of all things, because because I was the marketing, I was the social media coordinator of Kodansha USA for a while, and I worked on volume 6 and 7 of the manga when it was being re-released. So I have like my nerd card there in that one specific thing. But she was like, "Hey, you're kind of know a lot of stuff about a nerd culture, and you're in this. I have this book that I want someone to write, and I want you to write it." So Geekerella is technically a work for hire. It's what we call an IP project. So I got hired to write Geekerella, and she gave me full reign on the entire thing. She was like, here's a 1-paragraph summary of what this book is going to be about. You go and have your fun with it. So that's kind of what I did. And at the time, I wanted to write what I knew best, and what I knew best was the nerd community, was the geek community, was conventions and cosplays, and finding like your community on the internet, because like I rarely found it in person. I always, like, most of my best friends were these nameless usernames on these message boards for years, until we finally met. And then me and my friend Katie, we've been friends ever since. They're also a novelist now. And so yeah, that's kind of how I began. I wrote what I kind of knew, and then the things that I didn't know, I would talk to people about it, because there's a lot of research that goes into writing things.
Oh, no matter what you're writing.
Yeah, no matter what you're writing. So I ended up talking to some of the authors who, some of the fanfic authors who wrote like some of the original Spirk fanfic way back when, the Spock Kirk fanfic from Star Trek, which is how fanfic basically came about. Was some really great women who made a fanzine and passed it around to their friends and neighbors. So that was really fun, and that kind of inspired a lot of like the nuances in Geekerella, and then Princess and the Fangirl, and then Bookish and the Beast. So that's kind of where that comes from. And then the nerd references in the Dead Romantics just come from my unabashed love for romance novels. I have an entire room dedicated to romance novels at this point. There's so many.
I think, especially for younger emerging writers, the existence of fan fiction is so cool, because it is such a great way to practice and to, because you have a little bit of a structure to hang something on, so you don't have to sort of come up with everything yourself. But I know my child, who I think is ultimately going to be a much better writer than I am, certainly they're much better at age 30 than I was at age 30, grew up writing fan fiction, and that's how they sort of built up those muscles. And I think it's
I
really
wrote
cool.
Alice in Wonderland fanfic.
People keep asking me if I'm going to write a novel about Lewis Carroll, and I think, I had this discussion with a couple of other historical novelists about how we don't want to know too much. Like, if you know everything, then you end up writing a biography. And I think that would be my problem about writing about Lewis Carroll, is just knowing too much. But I do think, when you're talking about this subculture, I think there's an interest in readers in reading a book that sort of pulls back the curtain of something that you don't know about, whether it is an occupation or a subculture of some sort, or a country that you've never been to, or whatever. We have this fascination with sort of peeking behind the curtain. And in my novels, that curtain mostly is hiding the world of rare books. You heard that Bookman's Tale is about this possible Shakespeare manuscript, and First Impressions is about a book that may or may not have something to do with Jane Austen, and so on and so forth. And when I set out to write a thriller, I thought, well, this doesn't immediately seem bookish. I mean, okay, I have a character who's a librarian, but she's never actually in the library, because things start happening on the very first page, because I wanted to write a thriller. But I was at this exhibition in New York City. It was about Harry Potter. And it was rare books, a rare book exhibition that showed where a lot of these things in the Harry Potter universe, how they had their roots in medieval alchemical manuscripts and things like this. It was so cool. And they had this thing called an alchemist scroll. It was this scroll, it's probably twice as long as this table when they unrolled it. and it had all these just bizarre illustrations and things because it was supposed to be showing you how to do alchemy. And I was just starting to work on the Enigma Affair when I saw that. I was like, okay, I don't know how, but somehow this is going into the book. This is just the coolest thing ever.
Would it be a spoiler to tell us how it fit into the book?
Well, so let's just say that they do have to go to a library. So the book, the background of the book is sort of some of the weird stuff that the Nazis were into. And the historical bad guy is Heinrich Himmler. And Himmler was into some really, really weird stuff, other than things like, genocide. But he was into some very strange things and was fascinated with the occult. And so I decided to go down one of the rabbit holes of things that he was into. But I read, in researching him, I read this article that he had accumulated, AKA stolen, a library of about 11,000 books on the occult. And that somehow or other, nobody really knows how, these books had all ended up in the National Library of the Czech Republic in Prague. And I was planning a trip to Prague at the time that I found this out. So we were talking about, the first pair of authors was talking about place and wanting to go to the places that they were writing about. So I'm in Prague, and we go to the library, and I had arranged this tour because I'd seen that there was this amazingly beautiful Baroque room in this library. And I got up to that room and I thought, there's no reason in the world for my characters to go into this room, except that my readers are going to love this place.
And if it's not Baroque, don't fix it.
Right. So they got to walk through this room. I don't care why. So I put this scroll into Himmler's library and put a clue in it. And made them all go to Prague. So now we're walking around Prague with these friends of ours, and this is the other thing. And I'll be interested to hear if you do this kind of thing when you're researching, because you think of research as like we're going to libraries and look at manuscript stuff. No, I'm walking around Prague and I'm looking down back alleys and stuff. And finally, my friend Ron goes, "What are you doing? What are you looking for?" I said, "I'm trying to figure out where to park." He said, "What do you mean park? We're on a tour. We just get on the bus. We don't. There's no.
But not
we don't
for
have
us.
I said, "No." I said, "I have a character who's coming to Prague in a minivan, and I need to know where she can park it."
Absolutely, 100%. Like I lived in New York for a little while, but I do not remember any of like the road names or anything. But I was writing a book that I don't think is announced yet, but it will be in the next few weeks, where it mainly takes place in the Schwartzman Library, which is the New York library with the two stone lions.
Which I have scenes in one of my books too.
See,
we do have something in common.
We do. I mean, and it's such an atmospheric place to like set a scene or set a book, and so I wanted to set a book there. So I think I can navigate this place blindfolded now. I have looked at the online maps of this library, all like four stories of this place, and yeah, absolutely.
Have you read Fiona Davis's Lions of Fifth Avenue?
I have it on my to-read list.
Yeah, it's really good. But my novel before the Enigma Affair, Escaping Dreamland, is set in New York City, and a lot of it is set in the early part of the 20th century. It's about these three characters who are writing children's series books, which many of us grew up on, the Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew, these kind of things. And so I had to put, there's so many libraries in this book. But you do this research. I did a lot of research in newspapers because I didn't want to read what a scholar from the 21st century said about early 20th century New York. I wanted to see what it was like for the people who actually were there, who read and so I did a scene of the dedication of that library. So, but the coolest thing is like all the huge crowd of people were out around the back side of the library because that's where the presidential limousine was coming because William Howard Taft was going to speak at the dedication. But I put my characters at the front of the library because what happened was this one car drove up to the front of the library. One person got out of the car and started walking up those stone steps in between those lions. And when he was about halfway up the steps, somebody in the crowd realized it was William Howard Taft. He was literally sneaking in through the front door.
Oh my gosh.
And you see stuff like that, you're like, you got to put it in the book because it's so much better than anything you would make up. And that's what I find so often with my research is that the things I find out are just, again, like researching the stuff that Heinrich Himmler was into, and the weird people who convinced him of things. Like it's way more interesting and fascinating than if I invented something for him to be interested in. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I will see like a note of information. I'm like, okay, how can I insert this into my novel? I will absolutely take a detour to get here because I want it in this novel. I have written down so many puns because like The Dead Romantics is full of puns. There's just a lot of them. I am not sorry for any of them. Okay, maybe one, but But I would go hunting for good puns, and then I would figure out ways to insert those puns into The Dead Romantics because it made me feel joyful, and it kept me like I don't know about you, but when I'm writing, I always have so I'm like a dog with like a bone that's just out of reach. Like if I can get to this next thing, then I can like stop for a while, and so like I always have to have like this little treat for me, like as I'm going forward and drafting, because book writing is hard. It's very difficult, and it's not always linear, and it's not always hardly ever easy. And burnout is a real thing. But then you have a deadline, and you can't miss the deadline. So what are you going to do? Do you just keep writing while you're in burnout, trying to meet the deadline? Yeah, you kind of have to usually, at least in my line of work that I do. So. It's nice to have that little treat dangling in front of me, so I can keep moving forward.
So we have two books sitting in front of us that would actually go into a category in a bookstore. Like sometimes I'm not sure what category my books go into. I'm sometimes surprised I go in and I see all my books in the mystery shelf, and I'm like, well, I guess they are mysteries. I never really thought about that. Because to me, every good novel is a mystery because you want to know what's going to be on the next page. So you turn the page and you don't know what it is. So therefore, it's mystery. But you have a romance sitting in front of you. I have a thriller sitting in front of me. I think it'd be kind of interesting to talk about what makes a book a thriller, what makes a book. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So what makes a book a romance? What are the essentials that?
The only essential for a romance is there has to have a happily ever after or a happy for now. Like if there is not a happily ever after, then it is not a romance, and it should not be in the romance section. Like Nicholas Sparks is not a romance. John Green is not a romance. But so books that have happily ever afters, they are romances. Yeah. And yeah. I mean, and it's like different when you're like trying to categorize children and YA books, because like what constitutes as a YA book? Is it Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card, or is that children's? But it's shelved in adult. Same with Howl's Moving Castle. That's technically an adult book because he's drunk for half the book, by the way. But it's shelved in middle grade. So the like the categorizations, that it's just like how you feeling at the moment, friends.
Yeah. When I set out to write a thriller, I didn't really think about what's the structure. I just started to write, and I had read some thrillers, and in particular some that were connected to World War II, like The Key to Rebecca, which I actually mentioned in this book, and I'd read some Frederick Forsyth and some Ken Follett, but when I got done with the book and I started going around and talking about it, why is it a thriller? I've got to tell these people why it's a thriller. And I realized that the person that taught me what a thriller is was a guy named Alfred Hitchcock. And that I had actually studied Hitchcock in film class in high school, and I suddenly heard the voice of my teacher going, ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, and all these things. But the idea that you are being chased by the good guys and the bad, like you can't turn to the police because they're after you also. So if you think of North by Northwest, if you haven't seen it yet, that's your fault. You've had since 1957. So spoilers are coming.
There are some young people in this group.
We've had to catch up
this
is at the beginning of the movie. He gets framed for murder, so now the bad guys are after him and the police are after him too. So you can't. So isolating your protagonist in that way. All of those things I learned from Alfred Hitchcock, and he doesn't always do this, but I think I want my thriller to be the kind of thriller. A lot of people say, oh well, your protagonist needs to be in mortal peril at some point, or your protagonist should be in mortal peril in the first third of the book, or in the first chapter of the book even. And my response was, nuts to that. First sentence for me. So the first sentence of the Enigma Affair is, it wasn't just the bullet passing by Patton's left ear that concerned her. And a lot of people seem to think that makes them interested in reading the second sentence, which is, let's be honest, that's the job of the first sentence.
That is a hook. That's a good hook. That's fantastic. How do you craft a good first line? Because I know for me, I go through so many iterations of a first line before I finally find one that I like.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it pops. It's almost never the first thing that you write. And I feel the same thing about last lines too. Yeah. That sometimes they just call to you. In my novel Escaping Dreamland, there was this line about 40 pages from the end of the book that every time I went through a draft, I would get to that line and I would just have this gut emotional reaction to that line. It would just hit me in the solar plexus, and I would just, the page would get blurry because, and finally after about the
sometimes you just know.
Yeah.
It's like an instinctual thing. I remember at first, when I was first starting out writing, I did not know how to craft a novel. It was like groping in the dark because like how like my favorite authors wrote their books wasn't how I write my books. I write my books in like a week and a half, and then I spend like 4 months editing it because I'm on deadline, guys. but yeah, so like it's really fun to talk to other authors about their how they write. So how do you write? How long does it take? What do you start with first, an idea or a line?
So to me, it's different for every book, really. Ideally, what I do is I spend 6 months, a year, 2 years, just with it in the back of my head and just writing down little sketches of characters and things. I mean, because I'm doing other stuff, it's not like, sometimes that's while you're also working on a new book or whatever. But the discipline part of it is writing that first draft. Mm-hmm. And ideally for me, I like to knock out a first draft in 3 months. That I don't always have the 3 months to do it, because it means I've got to have sort of nothing else to do for those 3 months. And then it's 10,000 words a week. Mm-hmm. And that's not a goal. That's just my job. I don't like the word goal, because a goal implies that you might not reach it. Whereas if it's your job, if you're like, nobody wants to go into surgery and halfway through the operation, the doctor goes, I kind of got surgeon's block today, so I'm not going to finish this up. It's our job to write stuff. We need to do our job, and then there is also the revising. I've done some books where the revising was a couple of more passes, and I've done some where it was 2 years of major rewriting, so it's just.
Like every book is different, and I saw some like discussions on TikTok about how books that are written quickly aren't as good as books that take years to write, and that's kind of not true whatsoever, because the more experience you have, the quicker you can write if you know what you're writing about. If it's like a genre that you know, or if it's a character or a story that you know, it will come a lot quicker than like feeling your way through a new type of novel. Like if I sat down to write a thriller, I could not do it in a week. But if I sat down to write a romance, I know what beats I have to hit. I know by the 20% mark they have to like have some sort of like, risque meeting, and then by the 80% mark, they're on their way to a happy ending. So like I know what I have to meet, but in a thriller, that's not quite the case.
Yeah, but I think it's true. I think it's different for every book, mm-hmm. And I have some days when I could crank out, especially when you're getting near the end. I might write 4,000 or 5,000 words in a day, because you know where the roller coaster is headed at that point. I do most of my rewriting in the first half of the book, mm-hmm. because that's when I don't necessarily know where it's going. But I worked as a playwright for 11 years, writing plays for kids. And so when I get to dialogue, like I fly through dialogue, because those dialogue muscles are just, built up.
Yeah, it's like you know, like
and
the
then
rhythm
and then
of
it just depends on like how many ideas do you have. When I started writing plays for kids, like the first play I wrote, I could pour in every cool idea I had. I wrote it in 3 days, and it has remained my best-selling play. It's been produced thousands of times. The ones that I wrote near the end, it took me longer because I was running out of ideas that would be good for third graders on stage. You know,
I mean, like you're like scraping the bottom of the barrel, and it's like, okay,
yeah,
what
it was
can I
time,
reuse and how
and
can
that
I
was when
reuse
my
it?
first novel sold. So it was like, great, I guess I'm a novelist now. I think. Do we have time for a few questions? I think we have time for a few questions. I know we started a little bit late, so we kind of wandered on, but
Sorry
we'd
about
love
that.
to hear your.
My first question is, am I still embarrassed that I mixed up the two Lewises? Yes, I am. 100%. I'm
Don't
running
be.
on 4 hours
Don't
of
be.
sleep.
You're
I'm
in
so
you're
sorry,
in very
guys.
very good company.
I'm so sorry.
So I just finished reading The Dead Romantics, and I am in the middle of Geekorilla.
Oh.
And there's a common theme in those books that the father's dead.
Yeah, I mean,
So is that an issue for you, or why are we killing off the fathers?
so for Cinderella, it's kind of a thing you have to kill off the dad in Cinderella. It's part of the trope. For the Dead Romantics, I had a scare with my dad. My dad and I are really close, and I had a scare. So he's still alive, by the way, but yeah. So that's I wanted to explore that. And I recently had another loved one pass recently, and so I wanted to explore that kind of grief.
It's, when I'm in Escaping Dreamland, my novel, all 4 of the main characters have fathers who pass away, and I wasn't really trying to do anything with that. But between the time that I wrote the book and the time that it was published, my father passed away, and it became a completely different book for me.
Yeah, like it definitely changes.
A silly question.
Please.
With The Dead Romantics, is Ben Andor, is he
no.
Ben
Oh
Solo?
no. Oh no.
Is there like some Andor?
Next question. Absolutely. It is like my favorite Raylo dynamic. Yeah. So it was a Star Wars question. Ben Solo is Kylo Ren, and so there's a subset of Star Wars fans who really love Raylo, and I'm a part of that subset because I like Raylo. But of course, like Florence and Ben have a different relationship than anything Raylo does. So it's not like the love hypothesis, obviously.
For me, right now, my current publisher is Blackstone, who is the largest independent producer of audiobooks in the world. So they know audiobooks in and out. They send me audition tapes for usually about 5 or so readers. When I was with Penguin, they would send me audition tapes, but it was just like, here's what this person sounds like. With Blackstone, they send me the people reading the first chapter of my book, which is pretty cool. So you can hear if they get it. And actually, Blackstone did Book of the Seven Spells too, audio, even though they didn't publish the book. And so I listened to it. I picked my favorite. Then my wife, who was the director of all the plays that I wrote and is a really good casting person, listens. Every time we've picked the same person. One time I had the guy on my podcast. It was really fun talking to somebody who had done the audiobook for my book. But for The Bookman's Tale, the guy that we picked is so soothing that a few years ago I had some surgery and I was having trouble sleeping at night. And so I would put that on because I know what happens. I wasn't going to be, And so if you need to go to sleep, get the audiobook of The Bookman's Tale. It'll put you right out. Yeah.
Oh man, that's amazing that they all read the first chapter and then you get to pick that.
It was
way.
so cool when I
That's
went with them.
wild.
Yeah.
Yeah, basically the same. But I don't have the first chapter read. I just have to pick from samples that they've already had. But I have like maybe 5 to choose from, and then I don't always get the choice I pick because of like booking.
The
conflicts.
scheduling has something to do with it too.
Always has something to do with it. But I love the narrator for The Dead Romantics because she also narrated Dumplin', which is fantastic. I love Julie Murphy. So yeah, it was really special to have her.
I love the narrator for the Enigma Affair because when it came out, she tweeted that it was her favorite book to read that year. So
I love that.
So now she's my favorite narrator of all of them.
She's looking at all your jobs. Well, I think you can speak to that a lot better.
Yeah, I have a lot of real people in my books. Most of the real people in my books are dead, and many of them are famous. So you know, as far as legal issues, there really aren't any. I always put an author's note in the back of my books because I do write a lot of historical fiction, and that tells you kind of what was real and what wasn't real. But I also pick the kind of people that, because sometimes you're like, oh, I've heard people go, I put a real person in my book, and then I got a fan letter from them. It was so cool. Aww. Like, you know, the real person in The Bookman's Tale who's still alive is this guy who was a forger and convinced the Mormon church to rewrite their entire history based on forged documents, and then started sending out pipe bombs, and he's now in federal prison for multiple homicide. And like, I really don't want a fan letter from Mark Hoffman. I'm sorry. Call me crazy, you know. But yeah, I really like putting real people in a book. Like, I don't want to write a novel about Henry VIII. I want to write The Lost Book of the Grail, which shows you what ordinary people went through when Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, for instance. You know, I like to show how the events of history play out in the lives of ordinary people. But it's really fun to have my fictional characters cross paths with real events and with real people, like William Howard Taft walking up the steps of the New York Public Library. You know.
So cool. I try not to include real people in my novels. Unless I don't like them. Then they die, unless it's my dad, and then he just is going to die anyway. I really love, she's only written one adult novel so far, adult romance, but I love Sangu Mandana's The Secret Society of Irregular Witches. It is so good. I cannot get it out of my head. I read it back in September, and it's one that I keep going back to. Also, I just finished reading My Roommate is a Vampire by, I think it's like Jessica Levine. It's adorable. I ended up blurbing it. I laughed out loud because like for me, like romances have to be funny for me to really like them a lot. And yeah, it was definitely one that I liked.
Oh, wouldn't it be great to have your book banned? Yeah. That's when you know you made. So Alice gets included in a list of banned books primarily because for a brief period of time in the People's Republic of China, it was banned because it put human beings and animals on a par with each other because they had conversations together. And it gets put on those lists because it's such a famous book, and you want famous books on your list of banned books because so it's, you know, it's not being kicked out of libraries in Texas or anything like that.
I mean, I've read a few fanfics where like it should be banned.
Oh yeah, but I mean, I don't know. I mean, the second volume of the Book of the Seven Spells is fairly intense. I mean, the villain is a small town politician who wants to become an authoritarian, and you know, you probably don't have to work too hard to connect that to current events around the world. So I don't know, maybe somebody will look into it and see, you know, but usually the reason that books get banned are so incredibly silly. Yep. They're not ever about anything essential about the book or the story or the sort of moral viewpoint or anything like that.
It's because this character is gay.
Yeah,
just like,
yeah. I mean, I'm writing middle grade, so these kids are not. I'd written plays for kids for a really long time, and when I started writing novels for adults, I kind of missed writing for children. And I was meeting with my agent one time, back when we used to do that in person, not on Zoom, you know. And I said, I miss writing for kids. And she goes, well, you want to write a YA book? And I said, YA, it's like, it's like vampires and drinking and romance and sex, and like I'm just not. It's dark and I think that Ashley's handling it just fine on her own. She doesn't need me to help out.
Recommendations for you.
And she said, well, what about middle grade? And I said, what's that? She goes, it's just like YA, only they don't end up in romantic relationships with each other. And which, okay, I know these are gross generalizations, but what she was saying, because I'd been writing for third graders, right? And so I like the idea of exploring friendships rather than romance at the age that, I never say how old these kids are. So therefore that lets out a lot of opportunities for getting banned. Yeah. Because they're not, these particular kids they're expressing their cultures more than they are their gender identity or anything like that. But, I think it's possible that one of them might be non-binary, but I'm not going to tell you which one.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much to Ashley.